Today, we're talking about something many caregivers deal with in silence. What to do when the person blowing up your phone is just as stressful as the person you're caring for, and maybe the same person. Welcome to the From Guilt to Good podcast, where we discuss all the things caregivers wish people would talk about, but don't, won't, or can't. Hi, my name is Jeanette Yates, the founder of The Self Caregiver. I cared for my own mother for several decades, and now I help caregivers set boundaries and use simple tools that make care and life easier so they can feel good, not guilty. Today, we're going to talk about using technology as an emotional firewall when you're dealing with a high conflict parent or family member and how that can protect your nervous system, your legal safety, and your peace. I am thrilled to be joined by someone who is using technology to protect people's peace in some of the hardest relationships of their lives. Sol Kennedy is the founder of BestInterest, an AI-powered co-parenting communication app that helps parents navigate high conflict relationships after divorce. A former Google product manager, Sol left a decade-long career in tech to become a full-time dad and found himself in the middle of a high conflict divorce that no amount of professional success had prepared him for. He built Best Interest out of that experience, creating a tool that filters harmful messages before they land, protecting parents' nervous systems so they can show up as their best selves for their children. Best Interest has earned the endorsement of Dr. Ramani, has been featured in Wired and Stepmom magazine, and was recently nominated for a Webby. While the app was built for co-parents, so many family caregivers know what it's like to manage care in the middle of narcissism, addiction, past abuse, or just really high conflict dynamics. Sol and his team are building tools that help people set safer boundaries, regulate nervous systems, and communicate in ways that are calm, documented, and child focused, even when the other person has no interest in being reasonable. And it is for that reason that I wanted to welcome Sol to the podcast today. So, Sol, welcome to From Guilt to Good.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor.
I really am so excited to have you today for several reasons. And I think I mispronounced your name, so I'm going to say it correctly this time. Sol is how you say your name. So
Soul
sorry.
like the sun. Yeah.
Yes, I know. Makes total sense. Anyway, sorry about that, but I will pronounce it correctly from now on. First of all, I always start by asking the people who join me what their caregiving experiences, whether they have any personally or professionally. And I did share a little bit about how you became a full-time dad and left your career. And so many of my caregivers that are listening or watching relate to that because they have also had to leave their career to go care for a loved one. And so that is relatable, but I also wanted to know if you had any other experience or anything else you'd like to share about
Well, I think the difference there is that I chose to leave
that.
my career so that I could be with my kids. And also, I made that choice without having any idea what it was going to be like to be a dad. And it can be really challenging for sure. It's its own version of caretaking.
Yes.
My parents are still around. They're young enough to not need my help. So I'm grateful for that. I assume one day they might. So I personally am not a caregiver, but the one thing that I really relate to is this idea of being in a relationship that I didn't necessarily choose. You know, co-parenting can sometimes look like caregiving in the fact that you didn't, for whatever reason, you chose to no longer be connected to this person, but now you have this high stakes relationship that you have to learn how to navigate while also potentially having a lot of resentment and challenges in the past. And so I can absolutely relate to that aspect of having a difficult relationship you can't say no to.
Yes. And that comes up for so many of the caregivers. You know, a lot of us, I grew up in a loving family, but we still had lots of problems and lots of I describe it as difficult family dynamics, right? And that made caregiving have an extra layer of emotional fraught with emotional baggage that might not be there in other caregiving situations. Of course, all caregiving situations are emotional. So one of the things that is very common in a caregiver's life is that constant fight or flight, which I can only imagine is the same in a high conflict situation. Like every time you get a ding on your phone, it's panic, right? So we're living in this constant fight or flight as caregivers. Every text or email from our loved one spikes the anxiety, maybe for, different reasons, but still What does ongoing digital conflict do to someone's nervous system? I want you to talk a little bit about that because that's something that we don't think about. We think about if we remove ourselves from the situation or we set a physical boundary, that might be enough. But even as caregivers, we are constantly on call, constantly on vigilance. And I'm curious about what that does to our nervous system and how using tech to filter some of that might actually help regulate us. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to take you into a story, a personal story of 6 years ago. I was, not running Best Interest. I was going through the early stages of a very challenging divorce. And there were a lot of tensions in our relationship. And I was receiving a lot of messages that were, like you said, very triggering. I was experiencing a lot of feeling in my body, uncomfortable feelings when I get messages or dings. And so I just very distinctly recall this moment of lying in bed. I'm in my new apartment or my new home, and I'm lying there and I get this ding. And it's not the text message ding that I know, it's the best or the Our Family Wizard ding. And it's a very distinct ding. And I knew it was a message from my co parent. And because of our history and because of the ways that we've interacted up until this point, I felt it in my chest. I felt my
Mm,
heart race. I felt the cold sweat. And I just knew that I wasn't going to be able to sleep without kind of waking myself up and reading that message. And it was that moment that I realized something has to change here. I'm not going to be
mhm,
able to move on with my life if I'm constantly tied to this drama that continues to unfold, right? And no blame. This is a dynamic that was created over many years, including during
mhm,
our marriage. And so in that moment, I thought, well, I'm a tech guy. I've run startups before. Maybe I'll solve this through technology. And so I thought, well, I'm going to hire a customer service agent. Called up a former coworker of mine and said, can you be a customer service agent for my relationship? And he kind of laughed at me and, what do you mean? Well, you're not going to be triggered by the same stuff I'm triggered by. So maybe you can just like read the messages, let me know what's important, strip out anything that's not. And then maybe I can feel more at peace. What do you think? And silly idea, but it worked. It actually really gave me a lot of ability to step back from that kind of constant fight or flight of engagement that was happening in my body. And it allowed me to be more present with my kids and with the next chapter of my life. And fast forward to 3 years ago, I was playing around with AI with my kids. I was making some fun stories with them of bedtime stories. And that night I thought, well, could it understand the language of my relationship? Like, what's going on here? And I fed it the history, and immediately I felt seen. I felt understood. I felt like it truly got what I was going through and why. Thought, okay, well, here is the technology that I really needed 3 years ago. I need to create an app that will help co-parents that are in my situation to experience peace regardless of the situation. And so what I would say to your question about how technology can play a role, even without an app, you can experience a lot of feeling seen, which is so important in these roles. Like you feel
mhm.
so isolated and alone, and you can't bring everything to your therapist. Or you only see them every few weeks. So I would just recommend using AI as a tool to get a second opinion because it can really help.
Love that you said that. Also, I do I do caution my fellow caregivers to be careful what you copy and paste into ChatGPT to get them to look at it. So, if there's any personal information that you get, don't do that. But you can ask you can reach out to AI to potentially craft a message back, that's a little nicer, or use something like Best Interest to help because I think
Well,
that's part of what you do.
yeah, and I appreciate the asterisks there, and we could get into that more if you'd like. And I think that yes, it can be a helpful tool, but like any tool, you need to be very cognizant of how you're using it, and you need to be aware of its shortfalls. And one of the big things that can happen in these situations is that AI, like especially when you're using something like Gemini or OpenAI, it has a tendency to just want you to like it. So it's
Yeah.
going to agree with everything you say, probably because they want that $20 a month from you, right?
Right.
And so just be very mindful of that, as it can get you into a bit of a a rabbit hole, and you can sort of end up saying and doing things that aren't helpful for your relationship if you
Oh,
get too
yeah, it'll
far with
probably
it.
give you some
So,
doozies,
yeah, yeah,
some real
yeah,
zingers.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, so one of the things I do like about the idea of having a an something in between you reading the text and responding to the text right away, like whether it's a friend, looking over AI or best interest, is the idea of, you know, just taking a moment to breathe, because after all,
Yes.
like, regulating the nervous system isn't about always being calm. It's about the ability to feel that anxiety and then bring it back down before you make decisions, right?
Yeah.
Your nervous system is doing its job. It's letting you know, red alert, right? But we want to make sure that we're back in that calm place before we respond. So, and that gives you time, right?
I think that's one of the
Creating,
yeah,
yeah.
sorry. It's one of the best tools that we have, and it's free. And that's setting a boundary with yourself, an internal boundary to actually delay all communication. I highly advise that if you're dealing with someone that is either antagonistic or just difficult, just say, I'm not going to respond for an hour to anything, even if it's like a simple question. If as long as it doesn't actually require a response in a timely manner, a delay will really help you take that breath, slow down your own thinking, and reduce the cycles that we can get in with these people of defense and attack and all that stuff. It'll allow you to just slow things down, regulate yourself, and learn how to navigate the relationship from a higher level view.
And a lot of people listening, they're probably hearing this not so much, maybe it is with their loved one that they're caring for, that they're thinking about this, but there's also siblings, family members, other people that are maybe giving us unsolicited advice, things like that. This is another tip that can really help, where it's like, just because the phone dings and someone has messaged us does not mean we have to respond. Of course, there are times that we have to respond, even when we don't feel like it, which is why just blocking or muting someone doesn't always work, especially when it comes to your caregiving situation. With my mom, we communicated a lot through texting because she was homebound and then eventually bedbound. But when she was still at home, she was still able to, get in and out of her wheelchair, but she wasn't getting out. Like, she didn't have a ton of interaction socially. So I was her, one of her only, you know, people that would that she could text me, she knew I would text her back. Well, eventually, like, this got to be a problem for us, and I was getting message via text message, Facebook message, all the phone calls, all of this all of the time, and very rarely was it something that was necessary for care. And I ended up having to use my focus settings on my phone and adjust. I didn't block my mom or mute her, obviously, but I did have certain settings where, it was a little bit harder for her to get in touch with me. So I knew that, like, if the caregiver was there, I could, ratchet down my notifications a little bit. The caregiver could come through, but my mom, it would maybe go into the focus, so, like, I could look at it later, knowing that if there was an emergency, the caregiver would call me. So, like, those are some things that I did, and I also realized that I did not always have to respond. The waiting to respond was so huge for me, um, because it allowed me to decide the way I describe it, and this is a totally different way. I didn't think about it as, like, waiting to respond. What I told myself is the answer to everything is no. Can you go get milk? No. Can you stop by? No. Can you bring me the no? And then later I could say yes. Now, obviously I didn't say no to her, but in my brain, I told my brain, you don't have to say yes. You're choosing to do this. This is your choice. You want to be your mom's caregiver. You get to decide what to say yes and no to. And then when I had a minute to remind myself of, who I was, what my goal was with caregiving, then I could go back and respond. I love all those tips. So one of the things that I mentioned in the intro was the emotional firewall. I love this phrase, and I want to break it down a little bit. For caregivers who are dealing with someone whether it's part of our care team, maybe it's just part of our family, or maybe it's our loved one that we're caring for. Can you explain what you mean by emotional firewall and how a tool like Best Interest actually works to buffer between someone? I know we've kind of already talked about this, but let's go deeper into that emotional firewall.
Yeah, you really touched upon that experience when you were talking about your mother texting you at all hours of the night and having to set those really carefully crafted notification settings. It's interesting to be living at a time where there is this almost expectation that we are always available to all of our friends, family members at any point, at any time. And I don't think that's the way that our minds are meant to work. I think that we do need time to slow ourselves down and to focus on our own thing and to always be getting these notifications. It's like whiplash all the time, right? And especially when you're dealing with someone that might be a little bit more on the challenging side and you're dealing with your own codependency. I kind of heard in that,
Yes.
like,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
and I need to do this, and very relatable experience. So with Best Interest, what I built is what I needed, which is I needed a way to silence my ex during the times that I was going to be with my kids or I needed presence with my work. I didn't want to get distracted by the messages she might be sending that were not necessary, right?
Hmm.
And in co-parenting, fortunately, there are, and it sounds like for caregiving too, there are certain things that are very important for you to know about right away,
Hmm.
right? I could imagine in a medical emergency, you'd want to know right away. So you don't want to silence them, right? But you would want to know even if you were in the middle of work, right? But it's so important to be able to discern that. How do you do that? How do you set those boundaries while also being available? It's a really tough problem. With Best Interest, what we did is we used AI. So when my co-parent sends me a message, if it is something that truly is an emergency, because AI can understand the message, is my son in the hospital? Is there, a need for homework that was missing from the backpack? Those sorts of messages are bubbled up so that I can take action on them immediately. Everything else is delayed until the boundaries that I set. So I can say, I just want to hear from my ex once a day at 9 a.m. after I drop off the kids. That's a good time for me. I haven't really started full time with work and I can help manage that communication. So that's what I'm saying about the emotional firewall is that you have to build in systems, whether or not they're software or they are practices, breathing practices, learning how to silence your phone during other times, telling the people that you're communicating with or caregiving for that you're not going to be available during certain times to give yourself that break. Those are ways that you can create that buffer so that you can have your own private personal space. It's so
Hmm.
important to be able to detach.
Well, and you talk about the safety to heal, this idea that we can't recover, we can't heal from those difficult relationships, we can't get through the day, but really that healing that needs to happen can't happen if we're still fighting with the person, or we're still in fight or flight, still fighting with ourselves. That safety to heal is so important. What does it look like when we actually start creating that safety to heal?
I'm so glad that you brought this up because it is so important and yet so hard to do to give yourself the space that you need to heal, especially if you're dealing with codependency. It is a dynamic that you've created in your life, whether you know it or not, of engagement. That the people that you're interacting with have this expectation of the way that you're going to interact with them, what you're willing to give up of yourself. And then you are constantly in your head bypassing maybe your greater understanding. It's almost like your own personal trigger that you're going into. Well, I have to do that otherwise. And then the fear, I think it changes for a lot of us. But I know for me, the fear has always been about losing those relationships or having something I do change the way they think about me, right? So unconscious, and it bypasses all of the things that I've learned about how I'm supposed to be and not be. And it's like an instinctual thing of jumping in and engaging. And so even as simple as just slowing things down in these relationships, slowing them, even though it's very uncomfortable, just taking a breath, slowing things down can really help because it helps you to get right with yourself and learn what are those little things that are causing you to react versus be more in the driver's seat of your engagements.
Yes, I feel I'm like been nodding my head the whole time because of course this was one of the things I actually wrote about it in my book about my caregiver burnout and how I started to heal from that while I still had to keep caregiving, right? This is basically what you're talking about, this idea of like, I have to create enough space to at least get to therapy. Like, and I have to not be able to answer, I have to not have to answer my phone for that hour because that defeats the purpose. Like learning that was creating those boundaries from at the, when I realized I was in the middle of all this. And like you mentioned, codependency, poster child right here. There was this, and I was my mom's caregiver for multiple decades. So we had a firmly established way things went. She asked for something, I said yes. She texted me, I answered. So that was the way it always was, had been. And it was so hard to set the first boundary with her because, well, first of all, I kept thinking I was going to set a boundary and she was going to follow it. It took me a while to realize the boundaries for me, not her. So that was the first thing. But then also terrified that I was not going to be, like she was going to think I was a terrible daughter. She was going to think I was a terrible caregiver. My aunts that were her sisters were going to think I was doing a crappy job. Like all of these things, the weight of the world, we had already been sharing our journey online. So I'm like, the world is going to think I don't know. So like, like everyone's going to hate me. It's like nobody's paying attention to you. But anyway, but this idea that we have that if we set a boundary, we are ruining, uh, the relationship that we have or the communication that we have is only going to get worse, whatever. What is a realistic first boundary? Is it just that time? Is it just setting that time?
You're reminding me of this moment when I was sitting in my therapist's chair and I just started seeing her. It was the first time at age 38 that I'd ever seen a therapist. And I'm sitting there and I'm just kind of going off on something that happened between, I think, my mom and I. And she said, "Well, you can set a boundary around that." I'm like, "What do
A
you mean a
what?
boundary? What is that?" And it was first the realization that there is such a thing as boundaries.
Yeah.
It's technology. And then it was this realization that, dear God, how do I do that? Like,
Hmm.
that's not something that I know how to do because it's never modeled. It wasn't modeled for us, right? And
Yeah.
especially if you're dealing with your own parent, like they don't probably wasn't modeled for them. So you're trying to teach this new technology. Of course, they're
Hmm.
gonna get it wrong. You're gonna get it wrong. So it's really actually not about them. It's about you.
Right.
How can you be with yourself and hold yourself and honor your own boundaries to get your needs met? And frankly, I think it's oftentimes a mindset shift. I know the thing that has helped me most to learn how to set boundaries with people and setting them left and right now is learning how to be the bad guy, to be okay with that, be right with other people not liking you because you're setting that boundary.
Hmm.
And that was a really hard thing to get to just let that sink in, to be okay with. But if you can get there, you're golden. And any boundary that you set, it's up to you to uphold and be willing to leave relationships that you can leave
Yeah.
if they're not willing to be there with you.
Well, and that is such a good point. And, for me and my mom, it was setting the boundary and then not expecting her to, if I said I'm not going to answer my phone after 9 p.m. and she texted me or called me and I answer it, that's not her problem. That's mine. And so I had to learn. I had a couple of funny, like moments where I'm like, why is she not respecting my boundaries? And then it was like, oh, that's because it's not her job to do that, actually. So, like, I had to check myself. So, and I do think we talked about this a little bit before we hit record. But, when we're thinking about this difficult relationships or perhaps even ones that are unhealthy, when we're talking about this in the context of caregiving, it is a little bit different than co-parenting, but there is that similarity of like, we can decide, yes, this person has hurt us in the past, but we still feel compelled to help them as they're aging, right? And we've decided to do that. But that doesn't mean that we have to not have any boundaries. We get to decide as caregivers what capacity we have to help other people and where to set the boundary. And I think that's such an important rule to have is, you know, I, I can help provide care here. These are the things that I can do. These are the things that I can't do. And maybe that means you have to find more support that does more of the on hands, things so that you don't have to be put in a situation that's negative for you or potentially dangerous. And I think that is part of what is great about what you're doing on the co-parenting side with Best Interest, but I think it's also something that we can take away from. Yes, we're communicating, yes, we're having these contacts with these people that are problematic, but we can set boundaries to keep ourselves safe, because the bottom line is if we're not safe, then the person we're caring for isn't safe either.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're responsible for our own mental state, and also I would add to that that there are many opportunities to change your mindset about really any situation. And for me that has been a big driver for personal growth. So we can look at these types of relationships, these almost obligatory relationships for whatever reason, as amazing opportunities for us to learn more about ourselves and to grow. And so for me, realizing my ex has been the biggest teacher in my entire life, that she has taught me so much about myself, allowed me to get to a place of gratitude about her, for her.
Mhm.
And that is so much more healthy for me and my brain to hold that than, oh, I'm a victim and I'm being
Right.
attacked. That doesn't help anyone, right?
Yeah.
And so like you can do that with the person that you're caregiving is, well, you're in this situation, right? We can spend all the time we want lamenting about it, or we can embrace it and say, okay, well, I have to deal with this person and maybe it's really hard sometimes and it's forcing me to set good boundaries. But guess what? There are difficult people all over the place that we're going to encounter throughout our lives. So
Right.
how wonderful to have a safe person to practice this type of technology with, so that when we are engaging with others that maybe aren't family members, maybe will just cut us off if, we rub them the wrong way. Here we have an opportunity to explore boundaries in a very deep way.
Yeah, and that's so true. And when you were talking, it made me think of my college ex-boyfriend and and like how crazy that was, and how now, with a good 30-year plus chunk of, not seeing him or encountering, I can look back at that experience and go, "Oh yeah, that was crazy, but I learned a lot and, I'm grateful for that time." So that is it does happen. It can happen where you can look back on something and see how you've grown. What do they say? You grow through what you go through, I think is one of those
Yeah,
sayings.
absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So for the caregiver who's listening right now, we're exhausted. We might even be scared to open up our phone because we know it's just going to be another thing, whether it's a message from a loved one telling us that we need to do something, or a message from the person we're caring for that is going to make us upset, annoyed, whatever. What are some concrete steps that someone could take today, whether they're using Best Interest or not?
So it all starts with learning how to listen to yourself. So when you receive those messages from these difficult people in your life, you can either respond, you can reject it, complain about it, like all of those things you can do, or you can choose this as an opportunity to learn how to get stronger and to grow from the experience and honestly be with yourself. You're going to experience emotions when you're dealing with someone like this that's difficult. You're going to feel upset. They're going to trigger you. They're going to find the places in you where you feel shame. But those are opportunities for you to heal and grow. And when you do that, then you're going to start showing up naturally better in those relationships with better boundaries, more self respect. It all starts with you. It all starts with how much you're loving yourself in this moment, how much you're caring. So the next time you get that message, I invite you to just be with yourself. Acknowledge that you're feeling an emotion, find it in your body, process it, take a walk, find a tool that will work for you to find yourself again, get back to a steady state, and then respond from that place. And then you've just given yourself this amazing technology that you can take to any relationship where you're feeling triggered. And that starts with understanding yourself.
Love that you said that. And if you don't mind, I'd love to take a few minutes and talk a little bit more, or like walk through that a little bit in more detail, just because I know what you're talking about when you say, where do you feel, what are you feeling? Where are you feeling it in your body? Because that is something I practice with my therapist all the time and have learned how to do. Spoiler alert, I tend to feel most of my immediate stuff in my chest. So when I get a burning in my chest, my solar plexus, if you will. and heart chakra. That's where I feel things in the immediate. So like during something, and then long term, I feel stuff and tend to feel stuff in my belly. But I know where I feel things when I'm getting stressed out. But can you break down a little bit more for someone who's like, wait, do you feel your feet? Like, what do you mean? Like, can you talk a little bit more about that? I know that's
Of
not
course.
really why we were on here today, but just to give people a little bit of a
I appreciate
deeper
that
understanding.
Yeah, I appreciate that opportunity to slow down. Again, very similar story with my therapist, sitting in the room with my poor therapist, a complete, newbie at all this stuff. And she stops me from my complaint dialogue and says, "Where are you feeling? What are you feeling in your body right now?" And as a man who at that point had not really acknowledged a lot of emotionality,
Mhm.
let alone I just remember thinking, what do you mean feel in my body?
Yeah.
There's nothing jabbing me or whatever, right?
Right.
But then when I sat with it, I noticed, well, gosh, I am feeling this pain in my belly. And that's where I feel my pain. I've learned that that's where my pain goes. And it's an interesting thing that I grew up with a lot of stomach problems.
Mhm.
I think I stored a lot of repressed anger and challenge in my belly as a way to avoid having to feel it. And I think that that's what it's really all about. That's my perspective, is that when we don't process in real time, animals are great. When they experience a difficult interaction or a challenge or something that scares them, they just shake it off, right?
Mhm.
We've lost that, or we don't have that ability per se to just shake it off. Oftentimes we're more reserved and we just let it pass us. We continue on with our work. We distract ourselves with our phone. We don't feel that feeling as it's bubbling up. And I don't know how this works, but it seems to end up in the body, stored somewhere for us to process later. And so sometimes we get to this place in our lives, like I found myself, where, gosh, I had a lot of stuff stored up in there. And
Mhm.
every time I would sit with that pain, I would notice that if I just sat with that for a while, all it really wanted was my attention. Sometimes a tear would come out. Sometimes I would feel it change and shift and go to another area of my body. Sometimes it would explode out of my hands like light. It was so
Mhm.
delightful. But it just took that slowing down. And now I've developed this really wonderful relationship with my body intelligence that I know that when I'm receiving a message from someone or I'm interacting with someone that I find challenging, I'm listening to my body first. And I'm letting it tell me what's going on. I'm not ignoring it. And that's been just a good barometer for me to assess my interactions and my relationships. So I highly encourage, if there is a listener out there that's hearing this and just it sounds like a foreign language, somatic experiencing or somatic psychology is a really interesting exploration to go down into, especially as a man who doesn't,
Right.
necessarily know a lot about their emotions.
And well, I love that you brought up animals because, of course, part of what we're talking about is how our body responds. And, when the sympathetic nervous system kicks in and we're dealing with that fight or flight is what's happening. Right. And I love there's a video out there. It's Impala or some fast animal, right? It is getting ready to be attacked by, the lion or whatever. I don't know. I might be mixing
I've seen this
continents.
video.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it. So, but and so what happens for those of you who haven't heard me go on about this, I love this. So, what fight or flight is doing is saying, what your sympathetic nervous system is doing when you're encountering danger. So, what happens when we're in fight or flight with our loved ones or with a phone, is our body is sensing danger. So, our body makes some decisions. It decides whether or not to fight the danger or run away from it, or it might freeze up, or fawn is another one. But for the animals, I typically, that I've watched videos, it's usually fight, or fight, flight, or freeze. So this impala decides I can't run away. So I can't fight, and I can't run away. So it freezes and it looks like it is dead. Like this impala is out. And then the prey, the predator leaves. Okay. Does the impala just jump up and go about its day? No, it takes a couple minutes, it gets up, and then it shakes off. And I love that part because we always focus on the first part, like fight or flight. Are we fight or flight or freeze? What are we doing? And it's like once we get through that, we have to get it out. And that movement is the somatic stuff that you're talking about, the shake it off. And so, a lot of, maybe I know some of the men in my life might be listening to this. I wonder if they listen mom's podcast, right? But, they're like, that's not my jam." But walking, playing golf, football, there's other things that we do that aren't necessarily, like, you don't literally have to shake it off, though, some people do. It's fine.
Well, I'd like to push back on that, if I may, for
Yeah.
a moment, because it's a topic I'm very passionate about. I grew up with the modeling that men don't feel emotions and that feeling emotions is weak. And I've learned in the course of my life through this process of transformation that, wow, it's powerful to be in touch with your emotions. And I think that that avoidance of our emotions is actually what holds a lot of men back from deeper relationships, more intimacy, and honestly, just more self control and power. The more you can regulate your own emotionality, the more you can actually, you're not just hiding from the emotions, you're actually above the emotions. And it just gives you a lot more control and dynamism in the workplace as well as in your relationships.
I totally agree. I should have been more clear. I was saying that as far as like the somatic moving and shaking things off, you didn't have to literally go outside and dance, although you could. It would be
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
There's other ways to move.
Yeah.
But there is that sense of, I know a lot of times that antsy feeling we feel, and I feel like it's like our body saying, there's something that needs to get out. So like move,
Yeah.
move.
Definitely.
Yeah, I could talk about the fight or flight situation all day long. I think and so speaking of gut issues, total side note,
Yeah.
then I'll rein us back in. But I remember having this epiphany in my life where I've had gut issues my whole life. I was seeing a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and she was talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So we've all heard fight or flight for days. Every caregiver, probably every co-parenting, probably every podcast you do, they talk about fight or flight, right? Like that's for both of our demographics. That's who we're talking. We talk about it all the time. But then in this appointment that I had, she was like, "Yeah, so there's fight or flight, and then there's rest and digest." And I was like, "Excuse me? What?" And the whole idea is while your body is in that sympathetic state, that fight or flight, it is shutting down everything it doesn't need for the next 30 seconds because it's got 30 seconds. You're going to fight or you're going to run away. Okay. So I don't need to digest food tomorrow if I'm not going to live past 30 seconds. So your digestion is one of the first things to shut down. And so when I figured out that like I was walking around in fight or flight all the time because of the situation with my mom and also having severe stomach problems, I was like, huh, maybe those are related. So anyway, like I said,
Yeah,
it's
I
fascinating to
believe
me.
it. I believe it, and I've lived it for sure. I had even I had Crohn's disease diagnosed as, and as an adult, I no longer take medicine. I don't need any medical support, and I'm fully cleared of it. And I think that it has a lot to do with the emotional work that I've done as an adult to clear some of that old trauma from my body. I think that there's a deep connection between our body, our health, and our mind.
Yes, agreed. I like having conversations where we can go where the conversation takes us. So thanks for going on that ride. But one of the things that I find most compelling about what we talked about today and the technology that you have created with Best Interest is the idea that the technology is not going to do the emotional work for you, but it's going to give you space to do the emotional work that you need to do. The takeaway that I am getting today is that what you've created and the tools you've created and the suggestions you've given us today aren't a replacement for, taking care of yourself, perhaps getting into therapy, doing some emotional work, getting curious about what's going on with your emotions and your body. All of that has to be done, but the tools can help you get enough space in your day in your mind to do that. Would you is that a fair thing to say or
Absolutely. Yeah, that is the goal of Best Interest is that our parents can learn how to and experience peace from day one just by downloading the app. And that peace can be brought to bear on being more present with their kids, doing the work they need to do to grow as humans. I just think it's so important And also, I'd like to say too, I know that a lot of your listeners aren't necessarily co-parents, but it is so common to have conversations like this where people say, "Well, what about my parent?" Or "What about?" And it's true. There are so many relationships like co-parenting that challenge us. And I'll tell you that we are exploring bringing best interest to those other relationships. So if there is a listener and they're interested in learning more, I'd really encourage you to reach out to me and connect with me because I'd like to know more about your story and how we can support you.
Well, I think that's so important because, like I said, I think one of the hidden things in the caregiving space is we're assuming that everybody has a great relationship with their parents and their families when they go into caregiving. And then it's still hard, but it's obviously a lot harder when we have trouble communicating. I'm still learning that in my own family dynamics. And so it's a journey for sure. And so thank you so much, Sol, for being with me today. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate you so much.
Thanks for having me on today. It's been a pleasure.
And you all can connect with Sol at bestinterest.app. I will also link his podcast and all of his socials in the show notes. So take a look there. If this conversation has resonated with you, please share it with a caregiver in your life. And if you haven't already, subscribe so that you never miss an episode. You can find more resources at JeanetteYates.com or, like I said, in the show notes. Until next time, feel good, not guilty.